The radio man's fingers trembled as he transcribed the intercepted Japanese transmission at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor. It was May 25, 1942, and Commander Joseph Rochefort had been living on coffee and determination for weeks, hunched over coded messages that could determine the fate of the Pacific War. The basement bunker, officially known as the Combat Intelligence Unit, buzzed with the constant chatter of typewriters and the scratch of pencils on paper, as crypt analysts worked around the clock to penetrate the Japanese Navy's most guarded secrets. Rochefort, a thin man with intense eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, studied the latest decrypt with growing excitement. For months, his team had been tracking references to an operation called AF, a target the Japanese High Command discussed in increasingly urgent tones. The breakthrough had come through a brilliant deception. Suspecting that AF might be Midway Atoll, Rochefort had convinced the garrison there to send an uncoded message reporting problems with their water purification system. Within days, Japanese intelligence had transmitted the information that AF is short of fresh water. The confirmation sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, was planning a massive assault on Midway, America's strategic outpost 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. According to the New York Times Historical Archives, Yamamoto believed that crushing Midway would force the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where Japan's superior numbers would finish what Pearl Harbor had started. But Rochefort's Codebreakers had given Admiral Chester Nimitz something no military commander in history had ever possessed: detailed knowledge of his enemy's battle plan. The intercepts revealed not just the target, but the timing, early June. And the composition of Yamamoto's fleet: 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and transport ships carrying 5,000 invasion troops would converge on the tiny atoll in the greatest naval operation since Pearl Harbor. In his cramped office, Nimitz studied the intelligence reports with the calm demeanor that had made him the Pacific Fleet's commander. He possessed only 3 operational aircraft carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, against Yamamoto's 4. The Japanese had more experienced pilots, more planes, and overwhelming firepower. By every conventional military calculation, the Americans were sailing toward annihilation. Yet Nimitz saw opportunity where others saw catastrophe. The intelligence advantage was unprecedented. He knew where Yamamoto would strike, when he would arrive, and how his forces would be deployed. More crucially, he understood Yamamoto's psychology. The Japanese admiral was overconfident, expecting to surprise a scattered and demoralized American fleet. Instead, he would find a concentrated force waiting in ambush. The decision was made in a secure conference room overlooking Pearl Harbor's still-scarred waters. Nimitz would commit his entire available force to defending Midway, gambling everything on Rochefort's intelligence and the skill of his outnumbered pilots. Admiral William Bull Halsey, normally aggressive to a fault, lay hospitalized with severe dermatitis, passing command of Task Force 16 to the methodical Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. As May turned to June, 3 American carrier task forces steamed toward their destiny, guided by the invisible hand of broken codes and brilliant deduction. The greatest naval battle of the Pacific War was about to begin, and for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Americans held the element of surprise. Dawn broke gray and ominous over the Pacific on June 3, 1942, as Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's Kido Butai, the same carrier striking force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, approached Midway from the northwest. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Nagumo reviewed his orders with the confidence of a commander who had never known defeat. His 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carried 168 of Japan's finest pilots, veterans of campaigns from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. The Japanese plan unfolded with clockwork precision. At 4:30 in the morning, Nagumo launched his first wave, 108 bombers and fighters racing toward Midway under the command of Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga. The rising sun painted their wings gold as they disappeared into the western sky, carrying death toward the sleeping American garrison. But unknown to Nagumo, the Americans were already awake and waiting. A consolidated PBY Catalina flying boat, piloted by Ensign Jack Reed, spotted the Japanese fleet at 5:34 a.m., breaking radio silence with the electrifying message, "Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320, distance 150. The trap that Admiral Nimitz and Commander Rochefort had so carefully prepared was about to spring. On Midway itself, air raid sirens wailed across the 2-square-mile atoll as Marines scrambled to their positions. Major Floyd Parks ordered every available aircraft airborne, obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, aging Douglas Dauntless dive bombers, and Martin Marauder medium bombers that had never been designed for naval warfare. The pilots knew they were vastly outnumbered and flying inferior aircraft, but they also knew that every Japanese plane they could damage or delay might tip the balance of the coming carrier battle. The first clash came at 6:16 a.m., 20 miles from Midway, as the Marine fighters intercepted Tominaga's strike force. Captain Marion Carl, leading Fighting Squadron 221, dove his Buffalo into the formation of Japanese bombers with reckless courage. The aerial melee that followed was savage and one-sided. The Japanese Zeros outclassed the American fighters in every category except pilot determination. Within minutes, 15 of the 25 Marine fighters had been shot down, but they had accomplished their mission, disrupting the Japanese formation and giving the ground defenses precious time to prepare. According to historical records, preserved in the National Archives, Tominaga's bombers struck Midway at 6:30 a.m. with devastating accuracy, but they failed to achieve their primary objective. The fuel storage tanks survived, the runways remained operational, and most critically, the American aircraft had escaped destruction by taking off before the attack. As Tominaga surveyed the damage from his bomber, he radioed back to Nagumo. "There is need for a second attack wave." This message would prove to be one of the most consequential communications in naval history. Nagumo faced a critical decision. His second wave of aircraft sat armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, ready to attack the American carriers that intelligence suggested might be in the area. But Tominaga was requesting that these same aircraft be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for a second strike on Midway's installations. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo made his choice. Believing that no American carriers were within striking distance, an assumption that would prove catastrophically wrong, he ordered the second wave rearmed for a land attack. In the hangars of his 4 carriers, ordnance crews began the laborious process of changing weapons, stacking armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes on deck while loading high-explosive ordnance onto the waiting aircraft. Unknown to Nagumo, at that very moment, Admiral Spruance's Task Force 16 was racing toward him from the northeast, while Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's Task Force 17, centered on the hastily repaired Yorktown, approached from the southeast. The Americans had achieved perfect tactical position, and in the carrier hangars of Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, pilots were receiving their final briefings for what would become the most decisive air battle of the Pacific War. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Midway, but the entire course of the Pacific Campaign. At 7:28 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the radio crackled aboard Admiral Spruance's flagship Enterprise, with news that changed everything. Enemy carriers bearing 040, distance 180 miles. Lieutenant Commander Howard 80, piloting a Douglas Dauntless scout plane, had spotted Vice Admiral Nagumo's carrier force just as it was recovering aircraft from the Midway strike. Spruance, the quiet and methodical admiral who had inherited command from the hospitalized Bull Halsey, faced the most critical decision of his career. Standard naval doctrine called for coordinated strikes, waiting until all squadrons were ready before launching a massive simultaneous attack. But Spruance possessed something more valuable than doctrine. He understood that Nagumo's carriers were vulnerable while their aircraft were being rearmed and refueled. At 8:06 a.m., Spruance made the decision that would echo through history. Instead of waiting for perfect coordination, he would launch immediately with everything available. "Launch the attack," he ordered, committing 116 aircraft, from Enterprise and Hornet to what aviation historian Gordon Prange would later call the most important single tactical decision of the Pacific War. The American strike force that lifted off from the carrier decks was a patchwork of desperation and determination. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led 14 obsolescent Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers from Torpedo Squadron 6, knowing that his slow, lumbering aircraft were flying coffins against Japanese fighters. Behind him, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey launched 37 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, while Commander Stanhope Ring led 35 bombers and 10 fighters from Hornet. But the American attack nearly ended in disaster before it began. Ring's entire strike force from Hornet flew the wrong course, missing the Japanese fleet entirely and running low on fuel over empty ocean. Meanwhile, McCluskey's dive bombers couldn't locate their targets and began to doubt their navigation. The precisely timed strike that Spruance had envisioned was disintegrating into chaos. At 9:20 a.m., Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet found the Japanese carriers first. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, a part Cherokee pilot from South Dakota, led his 15 Devastators in a suicidal attack against overwhelming odds. The Japanese combat air patrol fell on them like wolves, and the primitive American torpedoes that did reach their targets failed to explode. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 aircraft were shot down, with only Ensign George Gay surviving in the water to witness what followed. Time magazine's retrospective analysis noted that the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons, while militarily unsuccessful, accomplished something crucial. They drew the Japanese fighters down to sea level just as the American dive bombers finally arrived overhead. At 10:24 a.m., Lieutenant Commander McCluskey spotted the white wakes of Japanese destroyers and followed them to their source. 4 aircraft carriers in a neat rectangular formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed. What happened in the next 4 minutes changed the course of the Pacific War. McCluskey's dive bombers rolled into their attacks from 14,000 feet, screaming down through clear skies while the Japanese fighters were still climbing back to altitude after destroying the torpedo planes. Lieutenant Dick Best's 3-plane section targeted the carrier Akagi, flagship of the Pearl Harbor attack. At exactly 10:26 a.m., his 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the carrier's flight deck and exploded among the aircraft being rearmed below. Simultaneously, the rest of McCluskey's squadron attacked the carrier Kaga. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, diving through anti-aircraft fire so intense it seemed solid, watched his bomb strike near the carrier's island superstructure. Within seconds, both carriers were transformed from instruments of war into floating infernos, their hangars filled with exploding ordnance and burning aviation fuel. At almost the same moment, 17 dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, struck the carrier Soryu. 3 direct hits turned Japan's newest fleet carrier into a blazing wreck in less than 20 minutes. In the space of 4 miraculous minutes, the Japanese had lost 3 of their 4 fleet carriers and the cream of their naval aviation. The mathematical precision was staggering. Japan had begun the day with superiority in carriers, aircraft, and experienced pilots. Now, with most of their planes destroyed on deck and their carriers sinking, the tactical balance had shifted decisively to the Americans. The carrier Hiryu, steaming alone 20 miles north of her burning sisters, became the last hope of the Japanese fleet. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, one of Japan's most aggressive commanders, watched the smoke columns rising from Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu with the grim determination of a samurai facing inevitable death. His carrier was the sole survivor of the Kido Butai, but Yamaguchi possessed 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, enough for one desperate counterstrike. At 10:58 a.m. on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led Hiryu's attack force toward the American carriers, guided by reports from Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. The target was USS Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher's flagship, steaming confidently 30 miles northeast of the burning Japanese carriers. Aboard Yorktown, radar operators detected the incoming strike at 11:59 a.m., giving the Americans precious minutes to prepare. The carrier's Grumman Wildcat fighters, led by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, climbed to intercept the Japanese attack. Thatch, inventor of the Thatch Weave, a revolutionary fighter tactic that used coordinated turns to overcome the Zero's superior maneuverability, led his pilots into combat with methodical precision. The aerial battle that followed demonstrated how quickly the tactical balance had shifted. American pilots, flying improved aircraft and employing superior tactics, shot down 10 of the 18 Japanese bombers before they could reach their target. But 8 Aichi dive bombers broke through the fighter screen, and Lieutenant Kobayashi proved that Japanese naval aviation still possessed deadly skill. At 12:10 p.m., 3 bombs struck Yorktown in rapid succession. The first penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, starting fires among parked aircraft. The second bomb destroyed the uptakes to 3 boilers, reducing the carrier's speed to 6 knots. The third hit killed or wounded 66 men and knocked out the ship's radar. Yorktown's damage control teams, trained to a standard that would save countless American ships throughout the war, performed miracles of engineering and seamanship. Chief Machinist's mate Charles Kleinsmith and his crew restored power to the damaged boilers, bringing the carrier back to 18 knots within an hour. Flight operations resumed at 1:40 p.m., and to Japanese observers, it appeared that Yorktown had suffered only minor damage. This illusion proved fatal to Japan's last desperate gambit. At 2:30 p.m., Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same pilot who had led the morning attack on Midway, lifted off from Hiryu's deck leading 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters. Tomonaga's left fuel tank had been holed by American fighters during the morning mission, making this a one-way flight for the dedicated naval aviator. The attack that followed demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of aerial torpedoes when properly employed. Despite fierce resistance from Yorktown's fighters and anti-aircraft guns, 2 Japanese torpedoes struck the carrier's portside at 2:44 p.m. The explosions flooded the fire rooms and knocked out all power, leaving the 30,000-ton carrier dead in the water and listing 17 degrees to port. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's authoritative account, Admiral Fletcher, realizing that his flagship was crippled beyond immediate repair, transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria and passed tactical command to Admiral Spruance aboard Enterprise. But the Japanese had paid a terrible price for their momentary success. Tomonaga and most of his aircrew were shot down, leaving Hiryu with only 5 operational aircraft. Yamaguchi's last gamble had succeeded in crippling 1 American carrier, but it had also revealed Hiryu's position to American search planes. At 3:30 p.m., reconnaissance aircraft from Enterprise reported the surviving Japanese carrier's location, and Spruance immediately ordered a strike. 24 dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, launched at 4:30 p.m. for what would be the final act of the carrier battle. The Americans had learned the lessons of the morning: concentrated attack, precise navigation, and overwhelming force applied at the critical moment. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the fate of Admiral Yamaguchi's final carrier hung in the balance, and with it, Japan's hopes of victory in the Central Pacific. The sun cast long shadows across the Pacific as Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led 24 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise toward the last operational Japanese carrier. At 5:05 p.m. on June 4, 1942, Hiryu steamed desperately northwest, her deck crews working frantically to prepare the carrier's final 5 aircraft for a last-ditch attack on the American fleet. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, standing on Hiryu's bridge, embodied the fatalistic courage that had made the Imperial Navy legendary. He had graduated from the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, and understood American industrial capacity better than most of his colleagues. Yet he also understood Bushido, the way of the warrior, and he would fight until his ship could fight no more. Gallagher's attack commenced at 5:03 p.m. with the precision that American naval aviation had perfected through bitter experience. The dive bombers rolled over from 19,000 feet in textbook formation, their pilots remembering the lessons learned during the morning's chaotic attacks. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, despite mechanical problems with his aircraft, managed to score a direct hit near Hiryu's forward elevator. 3 more 1,000-pound bombs struck the carrier within minutes, turning her flight deck into a crater-pocked inferno. The destruction was swift and total. Hiryu's aviation fuel lines ruptured, sending rivers of burning gasoline through the ship's compartments. Her magazine of aerial torpedoes began cooking off in secondary explosions that shook the carrier like a toy. Within 30 minutes, the last of Admiral Nagumo's Pearl Harbor striking force was transformed from a floating airfield into a blazing wreck drifting helplessly on the evening swells. Yamaguchi faced the moment that defined Japanese naval tradition. Rather than abandon ship, he chose to remain aboard, sending a final message to Admiral Yamamoto. "Our planes have successfully attacked the enemy. We are preparing to make our final charge. May our death be as sudden and clean as the shattering of crystal." At dawn on June 5th, Hiryu rolled over and sank, taking Yamaguchi and 700 of his crew to the bottom of the Pacific. The strategic implications of the carrier battle became clear as Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the disaster from his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, faced the collapse of his entire operational plan. In one day, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and more critically, many of her most experienced pilots, the irreplaceable veterans who had spearheaded every major operation since Pearl Harbor. According to records preserved in the Naval War College Review, Yamamoto briefly considered pressing forward with his battleship force to shell Midway and force a surface engagement with the American fleet. His subordinates urged him to retreat, arguing that without air cover, the massive battleships would be sitting targets for American land-based bombers from Midway and carrier aircraft from the undamaged Enterprise and Hornet. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, Yamamoto made perhaps the most difficult decision of his career. "The Midway operation is canceled," he signaled to his scattered fleet. The architect of Pearl Harbor, who had promised to dictate terms in the White House, ordered a general retreat. The Imperial Navy's dream of decisive victory in the Central Pacific died with the burning carriers. But the Americans were not finished extracting their price. The heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, damaged in a collision while executing Yamamoto's withdrawal order, became targets for continuous air attacks throughout June 6th. Captain Richard Fleming, leading a squadron of Marine dive bombers from Midway, crashed his burning aircraft into Mikuma's after turret in a final act of defiance that epitomized the battle's ferocity. The human cost was staggering on both sides. Japan lost approximately 3,000 men, including some of her finest pilots and naval officers. American casualties totaled 307 killed, including many of the heroic aircrew who had sacrificed themselves in the torpedo attacks. Yet the strategic victory was overwhelming. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Navy had been decisively defeated, and the myth of Japanese invincibility lay shattered on the Pacific floor alongside 4 aircraft carriers. As the Alcatraz surviving ships of both fleets limped away from the battle area, the implications of June 4, 1942, began to resonate throughout the Pacific. The Japanese advance had been stopped, and the initiative in the Pacific War had passed to the United States. The gray dawn of June 7, 1942, revealed a Pacific Ocean transformed. Where 4 days earlier, Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet had steamed eastward with the confidence of conquerors, now scattered groups of damaged Japanese ships fled westward, their radio silence speaking volumes about the magnitude of their defeat. In Hawaii, Admiral Nimitz received damage reports and pilot debriefings with the quiet satisfaction of a commander who had gambled everything and won. USS Yorktown, the wounded carrier that had absorbed the full fury of Japan's final counterattack, presented Admiral Fletcher with an agonizing decision. The ship had survived 2 bomb hits and 2 torpedo strikes, her crew's superb damage control keeping her afloat through sheer determination and engineering skill. Salvage tugs were en route from Pearl Harbor, and there seemed hope that the veteran carrier might be saved to fight again. But the Japanese submarine, I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the damaged carrier since dawn on June 6th. At 1:36 p.m. on June 7th, Tanabe fired 4 torpedoes at the slowly moving Yorktown and her escorting destroyer Hammond. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier, breaking her back with massive explosions that doomed the ship that had helped win the greatest naval victory in American history. The loss of Yorktown cast a shadow over the American victory, but it could not diminish the strategic transformation that Midway had accomplished. Japan's carefully husbanded carrier force, built over 2 decades and manned by pilots trained since the 1930s, had been destroyed in 4 decisive minutes. On the morning of June 4th, the Imperial Navy still possessed battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in abundance, but without carriers and experienced pilots, these surface ships were largely irrelevant in the new warfare of the Pacific. Commander Joseph Rochefort, The cryptanalyst, whose intelligence breakthrough had made the victory possible, found himself ironically punished for his success. Navy bureaucracy, jealous of Station Hypo's triumph, transferred Rochefort to a shore command in California and denied him the decoration he had earned. The Washington Post later reported that this petty treatment of one of the war's greatest intelligence officers remained a source of controversy for decades. Yet Rochefort's contribution transcended personal recognition. The Battle of Midway proved that intelligence, properly gathered and skillfully interpreted, could overcome material disadvantage and turn the tide of war. For the first time in military history, code breaking had provided a complete picture of enemy intentions, allowing a numerically inferior force to achieve tactical surprise and decisive victory. The Japanese response to defeat revealed the cultural differences that would define the Pacific War's character. Emperor Hirohito, informed of the disaster by a shaken Admiral Yamamoto, reportedly said nothing for several minutes before asking quietly about pilot casualties. The Japanese press, under strict military censorship, reported a great victory at Midway, claiming that American forces had been devastated while Japanese losses remained minimal. This systematic deception extended to the returning survivors of Nagumo's defeated fleet. Wounded aircrew were isolated in military hospitals, forbidden to speak of what they had witnessed. Flight deck crews and ship's company were transferred to remote bases or new construction projects where their knowledge of the defeat could not spread. The Japanese public would remain ignorant of the Midway disaster until after the war's end. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and Midway, understood better than most what the defeat meant for Japan's strategic position. In a letter to a former colleague preserved in the Japanese Naval Archives, he wrote, "The enemy now knows that we are not invincible. They have learned that our carriers can be sunk, our pilots killed, our plans discovered. This knowledge will make them bold, and boldness in war often triumphs over careful planning." The Battle of Midway marked the end of Japan's expansion and the beginning of America's long advance across the Pacific. From Guadalcanal to the Philippine Sea, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, American forces would press westward with increasing strength and confidence, knowing that the myth of Japanese invincibility had died in the waters off a tiny atoll 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy had achieved what many thought impossible: decisive victory over the Imperial Japanese Navy in a fair fight. The Codebreakers had provided the intelligence, the pilots had provided the courage, and Admiral Nimitz had provided the leadership that transformed a potential disaster into the turning point of the Pacific War. The rising sun was setting on the Japanese Empire, and the long road to Tokyo Bay had begun.